Hi, friends. I want to apologize for the recording yesterday for social studies. There was no volume, and I did not realize that my microphone was not working until today. I usually record and check the video, and I made a mistake yesterday in not checking and did not realize the microphone was not working. Thank you for those of you that tried to watch the video and realized that there was no volume and giving that feedback to the teachers. I appreciate that. So let's take a look at what the assignment is asking us to do. If you've already done this, that's fine. Hopefully watching this video will give you a little bit more information. So the assignment is called Colonial America, Enslavement of Africans. Now, if you remember last week, we looked at the 13 colonies. What is a colony? A colony is a piece of land that is owned, that is claimed by someone that comes and claims it for their country. In this case, it was Europeans that were coming here to this land and claiming parts of this land for the country that they came from. So in this case, it was the British that came, and the 13 colonies was owned by England at that point. If you remember, we've also been doing an intense study on Native Americans that were already here on this land, indigenous people that were here, and before the colonists arrived. So we were looking at the interactions between the Native Americans and the colonists, and we learned a little bit about the trade that was happening between them. That was one particular type of interaction. The Dutch colonists that were here were interested, if you remember, in beaver fur. That was one of the things. And the Native Americans expressed interest in metal goods that were being made in Europe. So those were some of the things that were being traded between the two groups. The interactions between those two at times was peaceful, but most of the times it was not. And how were Native Americans treated by the Dutch colonists and other European colonists that were here? We've learned about that too, and how that was not a pleasant interaction. So now then what happened was there was another group of people that were forced to come to this land, and those were enslaved Africans coming from the continent of Africa. So before we go deep into that lesson today, and before we even start looking at the questions and any of the vocabulary in the text, I want to just say that there is so much information about this very important part of American history that it's really hard to cover it in one lesson. If we were in the classroom, we would be looking at it in more detail and depth. So I just wanted to let you know that this is not just a one lesson piece of information that can be shared in one lesson. So before we go ahead and look, the question here is, what is the meaning of freedom? If somebody asked you, what's the meaning of freedom? I wonder what you would say. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be free in our world, in our country, right? So let's take a look at what it says in blue here. It says being free means being able to choose what your life looks like without interference from others. Everybody wants to be free, but some people have more freedom and privileges than other people, right? So some people have the freedoms that some other people may not, and they may use it in the wrong way. Sometimes they use it in the right ways. Slavery is the opposite. It's the opposite of freedom. It takes freedom away from people. So it's really important to note that. Now, as we go into the text, before we do that, there are 4 really important words here that I'd like to go over. Chattel slavery. So chattel slavery is what was happening here for many, many, many years. And that was the buying and selling of people as if they were property. So when enslaved Africans were forced onto ships and brought to this land, they were sold as if they were property. We know that that is not how human beings are supposed to be treated, but that's what was happening. Enslavement means the action of making someone enslaved. Racial inferiority. That's 2 tricky words, right? Racial comes from the word race, right? Inferiority comes from the word inferior, which means to make someone feel less than. So racial inferiority means when one race is considered to be lower than another. If you are someone that is, uh, you know, um, showing racial superiority, you're making it look like your race is better than another. And in this case, during this time, what was happening is a lot of this racial inferiority, where a group of people were made to feel like their race was less than others. In this case, the enslaved Africans were made to feel less than the people who owned them, the enslavers. Preserve means to protect. So now that we know those four words, let's take a look at what this document says. It says chattel slavery in all the places that are now the United States began with the enslavement of indigenous people. So before enslaved Africans were brought over here, there was already enslavement of individuals that was happening on this land. Europeans enslaved between 2.5 million and 5 million indigenous people throughout America. Enslavement of individuals was common throughout the 13 colonies during the 1700s. Most of these enslaved individuals were people of African descent. The main purpose of American chattel slavery was to make money for enslavers. So I'm just going to pause there for a moment. It was the enslavement of individuals was common throughout the 1700s, but as we learn a little bit later, the first enslaved Africans brought to this land was in 1619. So it was happening a lot earlier than that, but became more common a little later too. Um, and here it says the main purpose of American chattel slavery was to make money for enslavers. Enslavers were the people that owned the enslaved Africans and viewed them as property. And the whole purpose of them doing that is because they wanted to buy and sell and make money. At least 12.5 million Africans were captured and forced into ships going to America. So they were taken from their homes. They were taken away from their families and put onto ships in some horrendous conditions and brought over through the Atlantic Ocean, which was known as the Middle Passage. And at one point, you will learn about that, and brought to this land. European colonists expanded, that means they made it big and wider, enslavement of Africans by forcing them to come to the Americas. So they started, when they first brought the enslaved Africans over, the act of that happening became more and more common throughout the United States. It got bigger and bigger. The first Africans in the colonies arrived in Virginia in 1619. And I just want to pause there. 1619. That was the first time that enslaved Africans were brought to this land. Last year was 2019. So that marked the 400th, it marked 400 years since the first group of enslaved Africans were brought to this land. They were sold as indentured servants and were likely set free after they served their 7 years to pay off their passage to the Americas. So there were people that were being forced to come here, and some people that were brought over here as servants were told, you can work for 7 years and pay off for that passage, that trip, and then we'll set you free. So some of them were set free, but some of them were not. And when they were not, they were eventually held as slaves, enslaved Africans. Enslavers chose to believe and spread false beliefs about racial inferiority, including many that still impact us today. In every place and time, enslaved people sought freedom. Enslaved people worked to preserve their home cultures while creating new traditions. So we have been doing having a lot of conversations around identity in our classrooms and in our spaces, and what makes a person: culture, religion, the language you might speak, the family structure, the gender, all of that, and so much more. And these people that were forced out of their homes and brought to this land, they all had identities, and to keep and maintain those identities, they worked really hard to make sure that they fought for freedom and that they preserved their home cultures. some folks that were really fighting for against enslavement of Africans were abolitionists, right? So these are just a few, to name a few of these heroes who were fighting for the end of the enslavement of African people on this land, and they're known as abolitionists. So here we just have a few. Abolitionists were people who tried to end slavery. There were many Black abolitionists. Here are just a few who fought for freedom for enslaved Africans. Frederick Douglass, you may have heard of some of these names, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth. So Frederick Douglass was a writer. He was also an American abolitionist, and he escaped slavery, became the leader of the abolition movement in Massachusetts and New York. And he really spoke up and was very, very courageous and bold, just like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, to speak out and against slavery. Harriet Tubman, another American abolitionist, escaped slavery also, and she rescued about 70 enslaved Africans using the Underground Railroad. And as you know, the Underground Railroad really wasn't a railroad. There were secret passages. Sojourner Truth worked for women's rights activists. She was a women's rights activist, and she was also an American abolitionist, and she escaped to freedom in 1826. And Harriet Tubman also fought for women's right too. So they were both known to fight for not just the end of enslaved Africans during this time, but also for women's rights. Really, really important. If you're interested in learning more about these important folks, Get Epic has some wonderful biographies, so you can check them out there. We have 3 questions for you, and they are: what was the main purpose of American slavery? How many Africans were captured and forced onto ships? And what did Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth have in common? If you can respond to these if you haven't already. Thank you. And again, sorry for the little glitch yesterday with the recording. Thank you for your patience and your feedback. Okay, bye.